Hello everybody! It's time for part 3 of our novel, The Young Visitors. For those of you who don't want to listen to an audiobook, don't worry, all of my other videos from the chateau are continuing as usual. I'm just adding a few extra moments of story time for people who want to listen to things during their social isolation and escape to another time and place. The Young Visitors is a novel by Daisy Ashford, who was only 9 years old at the time that she wrote it, and she perfectly captures life at the end of the 19th century in the late Victorian period. Everything about this book is a delight. For those of you who didn't hear my first video, please listen to that first, otherwise you'll be jumping into the story halfway through, which wouldn't do at all. So with no further ado, let's move on to The Young Visitors by Daisy Ashford. Chapter 6. High Life. Mr. Saltina awoke next morning in his small but pleasant room. It was done in green and white with monograms on the toilet set. He had a tiny white bed with a green quilt and a picture of the Nativity and one of Windsor Castle on the walls. The sun was shining over all these things as Mr. Saltina opened his sleepy eyes. Just then there was a rat-tat on the door. "Come in," called Mr. Saltina, and in came Edward Procurio, balancing a tray very cleverly. He looked most elegant with his shiny black hair and pale yellow face and half-shut eyes. He smiled in a very mysterious and superior way as he placed the tray on Mr. Saltina's pointed knees. "Your early beverage," he announced, and began to pull up the blind, still smiling to himself. "Oh, thank you," cried Mr. Saltina, feeling very puzzled compared to this grand fellow. Then, to his great surprise, Procurio began to open the wardrobe and look at Mr. Saltina's suits, making Italian exclamations under his breath. Mr. Saltina dare not say a word, so he swallowed his tea and ate a Marie biscuit hastily. Presently, Procurio advanced to the bed with a bright blue serge suit. "Will you wear this today, sir?" he asked quietly. "Oh, certainly," said Mr. Saltina. "And a clean shirt would not come amiss," said Procurio. "What about this pale blue and white stripe?" "With pleasure," replied Mr. Saltina. So Procurio laid them out in neat array, also a razor and brush for shaving. Then he opened a door, saying, "This is the bathroom. Shall I turn on hot or cold?" "I don't mind," said Mr. Saltina, feeling very hot and ignorant. "It is best for you to decide, sir," said Procurio firmly. "Well, I will try cold," said Mr. Saltina, feeling it was more manly to say that. Procurio bowed and beat a retreat to the bathroom. Then he returned and told Mr. Saltina that when he was washed, he would find his breakfast in the sitting room. When Mr. Saltina was dressed in his best blue suit and clean shirt, he strolled into the sitting room where a gay canary was singing fit to burst in the window and a couple of doves cooing in a wicker cage. A cheery smell greeted him as Procurio glided in with some steaming coffee. Mr. Saltina felt more at home and passed a few remarks about the weather. Procurio smiled and uncovered some lovely kidneys on toast, and as he did so, bent and whispered in Mr. Saltina's ear, "You could have come in your dressing gown." Mr. Saltina gave a start. "Oh, can I?" he said. 10,000 thanks." Then Procurio passed out, and Mr. Saltina finished his kidneys and chirruped to the birds and had a cigarette from a handsome purple box which he found on the desk. Then Procurio entered once more, and with a bow said, "His lordship is going to a levee this morning and thinks it might amuse you to go too. Could you be ready by 11 o'clock? "Oh yes, what fun!" said Mr. Saltina. "Have you any notion what a levee is, my man?" Procurio gave a superior smile. "It is a party given by the Queen to very superior people, but this one is given by the Prince of Wales, as the Queen is not quite her usual self today. It will be at Buckingham Palace, so you will drive with his lordship." Mr. Saltina was fearfully excited. "What shall I wear?" he gasped. "Well, of course you ought to have black satin knickerbockers and a hat with white feathers, also garters, and a star or two." "You surprise me," said Mr. Saltina. "I have none of those articles." "Well," said Procurio kindly, "his lordship will lend you his second-best cocked hat, as you are obliged to wear one, and I think with a little thought I might rig you up so as to pass muster." Then they rummaged among Mr. Saltina's things, and Procurio got very intelligent and advised Mr. Saltina to wear his black evening suit and roll up his trousers. He also lent him a pair of white silk stockings, which he fastened tightly round his knees with red rosettes. Then he quickly cut out a star in silver paper and pinned it to his chest, and also added a strip of red ribbon across his shirt front. Then Mr. Saltina surveyed himself in the glass. "Is it a fancy dress party?" he asked. "No, they always wear that kind of thing, but wait till you see his lordship. If you are ready, sir, I will conduct you in." Mr. Saltina followed Procurio up countless stairs till they came to the Earl's compartments and tapped on the bedroom door. "Come in!" cried a merry voice, and in they strode. "I have done my best with Mr. Saltina, my lord. I trust he will do. The hat, of course, will make a deal of difference." Mr. Saltina bowed nervously, wishing he'd got correct knickerbockers, as his trousers did not feel too firm in spite of the garters. "Not half bad!" cried the Earl. "Try on the hat, Saltina. It is on my bed." Mr. Saltina placed it on his head, and the feathers and gold braid became him very well, but he felt very jealous of the Earl, who looked a sight for the gods. He had proper satin knickerbockers with diamond clasps and buckled shoes and black silk stockings which showed up his long, fine legs. He had a floppy shirt of softest muslin and a real lace collar and cuffs. A sword hung at his side, and a crimson sash was round his waist, and a splendid cocked hat on his head. His blue eyes twinkled as he pulled on a pair of white kid gloves. "Well, come on, Saltina," he cried. "Don't be nervous. I will get you a pair of knickers tomorrow. Will you get a hansom, Procurio?" Presently the Earl and Mr. Saltina were clattering away to Buckingham Palace. "You won't mind if I introduce you as Lord Hyssops, do you?" said the Earl as he lit up his pipe. "You see, you're sort of mixed up with the family, so it won't matter and will look better." "So it would," said Mr. Saltina. "What do we do at the levee?" "Oh, we stroll round and eat ices and champagne and that kind of thing, and sometimes there's a little music." "Is there any dancing?" asked Mr. Saltina. "Well, not always," said the Earl. "I'm glad of that," said Mr. Saltina. "I'm not so nimble as I was, and my garters are a trifle tight." "Sometimes we talk about the laws and politics," said the Earl, "if Her Majesty is in that kind of mood." Just then the splendid edifice appeared in view, and Mr. Saltina licked his dry lips at the sight of the vast crowd. All round were carriages full of costly people, and outside the railing stood tall lifeguards keeping off the mere people who had gathered to watch the nobility clatter up. Lord Clincham began to bow right and left, raising his cocked hat to his friends. There was a lot of laughter and friendly words as the cab finally drew up at the front door. Two tall lifeguards whisked open the doors, and one of them kindly tipped the cabman. Mr. Saltina followed his lordship up the grand steps, trying to feel as homely as he could. Then a splendid-looking fellow in a red tunic and a sort of black velvet tam o' shanter stepped forward from the throng, shouting, "What name, please?" "The Earl of Clincham and Lord Hyssops," calmly replied the Earl, gently nudging Mr. Saltina to act up. Mr. Saltina nodded and blinked at the menial as much as to say, "All is well," and then he and the Earl hung up their cocked hats on two pegs. "This way!" cried a deep voice, and another menial appeared wearing stiff white breeches, top boots, and a green velvet coat with a leather belt, also a very shiny top hat. They followed this fellow down countless corridors and finally came to big folding doors. The Earl twiddled his moustache and slapped his leg with his white glove as calmly as could be. Mr. Saltina perspired rather hard and gave a hitch to his garters to make sure. Then the portals divided and their names were shouted in chorus by countless domestics. The sumptuous room was packed with men of a noble nature, dressed like the Earl in satin knickerbockers, etc., and with ladies of every hue with long trains and jewels by the dozen. You could hardly move in the gay throng. Dukes were as naught as there were a lot of princes, and archdukes as it was a very superior levee indeed. The Earl and Mr. Saltina struggled through the crowd till they came to a platform draped with white velvet. Here on a golden chair was seated the Prince of Wales in a lovely ermine cloak and a small but costly crown. He was chatting quite genially with some of the crowd. Up clambered the Earl, followed at top speed by Mr. Salteena. "Hello, Clincham," cried the Prince, quite homely and not at all grand. "So glad you turned up. Quite a squash, eh?" "A bit overpowering, your Highness," said the Earl, who was quite used to all this. "May I introduce my friend Lord Hyssops? He's staying with me, so I thought I would bring him along if you don't mind, Prince." "Not at all," cried the genial Prince, looking rather surprised. Mr. Salteena bowed so low he nearly fell off the platform, and as the Prince put out a hand, Mr. Salteena thought he'd better kiss it. The Prince smiled kindly. "I'm pleased to see you, Lord Hyssops," he said in a regal voice. Then the Earl chipped in. "And how is the dear Queen?" he said reverently. "Not up to much," said His Highness. "She feels the heat, poor soul." And he waved to a placard which said in large letters, "The Queen is indisposed." Presently His Highness rose. "I think I will have a quiet glass of champagne," he said. "You come too, Clincham, and bring your friend. The diplomats are arriving, and I'm not much in the mood for deep talk. I've already signed a dozen documents, so I've done my duty." They all went out by a private door and found themselves in a smaller but gorgeous room. The Prince tapped on the table, and instantly 2 menials in red tunics appeared. "Bring 3 glasses of champagne," commanded the Prince. "And some ices," he added majestically. The goods appeared as if by magic, and the Prince drew out a cigar case and passed it round. "One grows weary of court life," he remarked. "Ah, yes," agreed the Earl. "It upsets me," said the Prince, lapping up his strawberry ice. "All I want is peace and quiet and a little fun, and here I am tied down to this life," he said, taking off his crown. "Being royal has many painful drawbacks." "True," mused the Earl. Silence fell, and the strains of the band could be heard from the next room. Suddenly the Prince gazed at Mr. Salteena. "Who did you say you were?" he asked in a puzzled tone. "Lord Hyssops," responded our hero, growing purple at the lie. "Well, you're not a bit like the Lord Hyssops I know," replied the Prince. "Could you explain matters?" Mr. Salteena gazed helplessly at the Earl, who'd grown very pale and seemed lost for a moment. However, he quickly recovered. "He's quite all right, really, Prince," he said. "His mother was called Miss Hyssops of the Glen." "Indeed," said His Royal Highness. "That sounds correct, but who was your father, eh?" Then Mr. Salteena thought he would not tell a lie, so in trembly tones he muttered, "My poor father was but a butcher, your Highness, a very honest one, I may add, and passing rich. He was called Dominic Salteena, and my name is Alfred Salteena." The Prince stroked his yellow beard and rather admired Mr. Salteena for his truthful utterance. "Oh, I see," he said. "Well, why did you palm off on my menials as Lord Hyssops, eh?" Mr. Salteena wiped his sweating brow, but the Earl came to the rescue nobly. "My fault entirely, Prince," he chimed in. "As I was bringing him to this very superior levee, I thought it would be better to say he was of noble birth. Have I offended your royal dignity?" "Not much," said the Prince. "It was a laudable notion, and perhaps I will ask Mr. Salteena to one of my big balls one day." "Oh, your Highness," gasped our hero, falling on one knee. "That would indeed be a treat." "I suppose, Prince, you've not got a job going at this palace for my friend?" asked the Earl. "You see, I'm rubbing him up in society ways, and he fancies court life as a profession." "Oh, does he?" said the Prince, blinking his eyes. "Well, I might see." "I suggested if there was a vacancy going, he might try cantering after the royal barouche," said the Earl. "So he might," said the Prince. "I will speak to the Prime Minister about it and let you know." "10,000 thanks!" cried Mr. Salteena, bowing low. "Well, now I must get along back to the levee," announced the Prince, putting on his crown. "I've booked a valse with the Archduchess of Greenwich, and this is her favourite tune." So saying, they issued back to the big room where the nobility were whirling gaily, and the more serious people, such as the Prime Minister and the admirals, etc., were eating ices and talking passionately about the laws in a low undertone. The Earl was soon mingling gaily in a set of lancers, but Mr. Salteena dare not because of his trousers. However, he sat on a velvet chair and quite enjoyed overhearing the intelligent conversation of the Prime Minister. And now we will leave our hero enjoying his glimpse of high life and return to Ethel Montague. Chapter 7. Bernard's Idea. After Mr. Salteena had departed, Bernard Clark thought he would show Ethel over his house, so they spent a merry morning so doing. Ethel passed bright remarks on all the rooms, and Bernard thought she was most pretty, and Ethel began to be a bit excited. After a lovely lunch, they sat in the gloomy hall, and Ethel began to feel very glad Mr. Saltina was not there. Suddenly, Bernard lit his pipe. "I was thinking," he said passionately, "what about going up to London for a week's gaiety?" "Who?" inquired Ethel in a low tone. "You and me," said Bernard. "I know of several splendid hotels, and we could go to theatres and parties and enjoy ourselves to the full." "So we could! What an idea!" cried Ethel. So the merry plan was all arranged, and they spent the afternoon in packing their trunks. Next day they were all ready in the hall when the handsome vehicle once more clattered up. Ethel had on her blue velvet get-up and a sweet new hat and plenty of rouge on her face, and looked quite a seemly counterpart for Bernard, who was arrayed in a white and shiny mackintosh, top boots, and a well-brushed top hat tied onto him with a bit of black elastic. "Well, goodbye, Minute," he cried to the sombre butler. "Take care of your gout and the silver, and I will pay your wages when I come back." "Thank you kindly, sir," murmured Minute. "When may I expect your return?" "Oh, well, I will wire," he said, and dashed down the steps. Ethel followed with small, ladylike steps, having bowed politely to Minute, who closed his eyes in acknowledgement of her kindness. The sun was shining, and Ethel had the feeling of going to a very jolly party, and felt so sorry for all the passers-by who were not going to London with Bernard. Arrived in the gay city, Bernard hailed a cab to the Manor Born and got in, followed by Ethel. "Kindly drive us to the Gaiety Hotel," he cried in a firm tone. The cabman waved his whip, and off they dashed. "We shall be highly comfortable and select at the Gaiety," said Bernard, and he thought to himself how lovely it would be if he was married to Ethel. He blushed a deep shade at his own thoughts, and gave a sidelong glance at Ethel, who was gazing out of the window. "Well, one never knows," he murmured to himself, and as one of the poets says, "great events from trivial causes springs." Just then they stopped at the gay hotel, and Ethel was spellbound at the size of the big hall. Bernard poked his head into the window of the pay desk. "Have you a couple of bedrooms for self and young lady?" he inquired in a lordly way. A very handsome lady with golden hair and a lace apron glanced at a book and hastily replied, "Oh yes, sir, 2 beauties on the first floor, number 9 and 10. "Thank you," said Bernard. "We will go up if you have no objection." "None whatsoever, sir," said the genial lady. "The beds are well aired and the view is quite pleasant." "Come along, Ethel," cried Bernard. "This sounds all right, eh?" "Oh, quite," said Ethel with a beaming smile. They went upstairs and entered number 9, a very fine compartment with a large downy bed and white doors with glass handles leading into number 10, an equally dainty room, but a trifle smaller. "Which will you have, Ethel?" asked Bernard. "Oh, well, I would rather you settled it," said Ethel. "I'm willing to abide by your choice." "The best shall be yours, then," said Bernard, bowing gallantly and pointing to the biggest room. Ethel blushed at his speaking look. "I shall be quite lost in that huge bed," she added to hide her embarrassment. "Yes, I expect you will," said Bernard. "And now what about a little table d'hôte followed by a theatre?" "Oh, yes," cried Ethel, and downstairs they went. That was the end of chapter 7. Next time I will read the final chapters when things get rather romantic. I hope you're having a safe and happy time wherever you are. See you next time. Love from Lalande. A huge thank you to all of our patrons at Lalande who are making this vlog possible, especially our Marquise and Marquise of Lalande, Daniela, Laura de Murray, Caroline Forster, Brenda Gibbons, Maureen Palmer, Brian Woodward and David Young. And thank you to all of you.